Welcome to this set of programmes focusing on the letter to the Romans. This is the first presentation in this series. We're looking at the letter that Paul wrote to the followers of Jesus in Rome, and I've entitled this Introducing Paul's Letter to the Romans. The letter to the Romans, introducing Paul's letter. Paul wrote in the days of the Roman Empire, pictured here in the kind of orange-brown colour. An empire that conquered most of the central world around the Mediterranean area. Centred in Rome, about the year 60 AD, let's just look at the characteristics of this empire. The empire ruled quite a proportion of the world's population, but the world's population wasn't very large in those days. Only about 1 million held Roman citizenship. The others were really conquered peoples. Rome itself, the population is estimated to be about 1/3 but nearly half of them were slaves. The whole Roman Empire ran on slavery, drawn mainly from conquered populations. Life expectancy, it was tough. Only a few children survived to the age of 5. But of those who did, life expectancy could be around about mid-40s. Families tended to be big, but most did not survive. And the common language right across this empire was Greek. So Paul was speaking in Greek. We know this letter was written about AD 57 and that Paul was based in the city of Corinth in southern Greece, a very large city for those days. He outlined that he'd planned to leave Corinth and to go over to Jerusalem before heading right across the Mediterranean to Spain, and his plan was to visit Rome on the way. The distances are huge. Some of this would be on foot, some of this would be Paul hitching a ride on various boats that travelled for trade throughout the area. In Rome itself there were house churches, little groups meeting in people's homes, but overall quite a large Christian community, although a tiny minority of the population. Most of the Christians in Rome had moved there from other places, the capital city attracting them in for various reasons. There's no evidence that Paul ever visited Rome up to this point, nor is there any evidence that this Christian group had anything to do with Peter. Indeed, there's evidence that suggests that Peter had nothing to do with the followers of Jesus at Rome at this point. At various points, the Jews were expelled from Rome, and Christians were just lumped in with them by the Roman authorities. And the last expulsion took place about AD 49. But within a year or two, the Jews and the Christians returned. Now, Paul knew quite a number of people in Rome, in the Christian communities, because he'd met them in his travels, as people had moved around. Paul did a lot of writing. Now, in fact, he didn't write, he dictated. In the case of Romans, we know the name of the man who wrote it down for him, a man called Tertius. Paul would speak, and he would have a scribe writing it down for him. Let's look at the dateline of the 1st century. We know from the records of the New Testament, confirmed by the records, the secular records from the Jewish historians and Roman records, the lifespan of Jesus and his death and resurrection about that year. Paul's first letters, perhaps Galatians first, or maybe the Thessalonians letters first, about that point. His letters to the followers of Jesus in Corinth came there. We don't know exactly when Philippians was written, but perhaps somewhere in that span of time. But that's where he was writing the letter to the Romans. Letters followed that to other Christian groups. And we know that the letters were collated somewhere before the end of the century. It's an interesting thought that Paul probably had no idea that the letters that he'd written, which were sent personally to various groups round the Mediterranean area, he probably had no idea and no expectation that these would be collated, that they would be kept, and we found to be useful. Because the people carefully kept the letters, they copied them, because they found the teaching of Paul was so useful at that time. And we have records that one of the leaders of the Christians in Rome quoted extensively from this particular letter that Paul wrote to the Romans. And he quoted about AD 96. So we know a lot about Paul's writings, and we know a lot about the impact they had, although perhaps Paul could never have expected that impact to have occurred. There's a description. Let me read it to you. A unique combination of the spiritual and the logical, without parallel in human literature. It unfolds the most sublime spiritual truth in terms of the most flawless logic. That's the description of the letter to the Romans in the writings of Dr. Derek Prince, an intellectual philosopher who later became one of the greatest Bible teachers of the latter end of the 20th century. This book has had a huge impact because it's a systematic presentation of Christian truths. It ties tightly to the life of Jesus and to the teachings of Jesus. And that's the description we have. I could put it this way, a systematic presentation. Truths and principles underpinning the meaning of the life, teaching, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Written by Paul, and Paul was an intellectual, spiritual giant. Professorial caliber, highly educated, fluent in the languages of his day. And he grasped the significance of all that Jesus came to say and do. And it was written not long after the actual time of Jesus, when everything was fresh. This is of enormous value for us today. Looking at the letter as a whole, and the letter by letter standards of those days, is extraordinarily long. Letters in those days were short. This is most unusual. Starts, of course, with a prologue and introduction, even that is long, where Paul introduces the theme of the letter and speaks about his own ambitions to come and visit them in Rome. Then it moves to what I've called the heart of the gospel. It addresses a fundamental question of human failure and how we become acceptable to God. And it pictures this and defines and describes what's meant by faith and how God's grace works in relation to humanity. Absolutely core ideas. This leads on to security and hope for those who lay hold of this. Paul speaks about our status in Christ, characteristic phrase, in Christ, identified in him. It speaks of the freedom of the followers of Jesus, but it also speaks of the central role of the Holy Spirit, there to equip us, there to empower us, there to enable us to cope, there to enable us to live for Jesus. Paul addresses the great division of the day. The Jewish nation saw themselves as the chosen people of God and looked down on those who weren't Jews, called Gentiles. But many of the Jews had rejected Jesus. Paul addresses that question. Where do the Jews fit into all of this? Their rejection, and what about the future? And he returns to transformation in Jesus. And he draws out all this teaching into the practicalities of lifestyle, empowered by the Holy Spirit who enables us to live for Jesus, all in a context of love and unity. Beautiful picture. Then he brings it to conclusions. That's the rough structure of this book. But it starts by focusing around a key problem. God is perfect. We are not. We do terrible things to each other and to this planet. How do you bring these things together? The God of perfection, the God of love. And we are not perfect. Fundamentally that. How can we be acceptable to God? I put it in Paul's language, be righteous before God. He who is perfect in everything he is and does, and we are definitely not. How can we humans, with all our frailties and failings, be acceptable to our Maker? Fundamental question. Paul doesn't address all the human answers because some of them didn't really exist at that time in the Roman Empire. But here's some of the answers humans have come up with over the centuries. Some people just reject that there is a God at all. They put man at the centre of everything. We call this humanism, and it comes in various forms and guises. But there is no God. It's all chance, and there is nothing after death. So the issue doesn't arise. In Paul's day, people didn't go down that line, but they tended to reject the idea of a righteous God. So in the Roman Empire, following the Greek Empire before it, they had multiple gods, and these gods were pictured like human beings, kind of super powerful human beings, who had husbands and wives, who had children, and who did things good and did things bad. So the idea of righteousness and perfection didn't really exist. And scattered all over the Roman Empire, there were little temples to all kinds of gods. Gods that really reflected the nature of humanity. And indeed, in a decade or two, the Roman emperors would proclaim themselves as a god, and people would have to worship them. A problem that faced the early followers of Jesus. In Buddhism, that resolves the problem. In Hinduism, once you're dead, you come back in some other form. And if you lived a good life now, you come back in a better form in the next life. I ask questions: what evidence supports either being absorbed into deity or recycling? Is that not just speculation? In Islam, the idea is to follow God's rule book. The Quran lays down the rules. They've been supplemented by the Hadith. They're collated in Sharia law. You don't argue with them, you just accept them and you obey them without question. And if you obey enough of them, maybe God will let you into paradise. Maybe you'll be acceptable to him. We'll come back to that one in a moment or two. So often in the West, we see God as some kind of sugar daddy, a benevolent grandfather in the sky with white hair, who will say, "It's okay, I understand, pat us on the head, and all will be well." And so we cross our fingers and hope that it'll be okay. Now, if you think about all of these, essentially they've got a strong element of selfishness, because they're centered on ourselves and our personal futures. And they don't really get at or drive at our relationships with each other or with this planet. And they don't really drive at our relationship with God as our creator. They're very much centered around ourselves. So let's wipe out some of these speculative ideas, human answers. This is where Paul takes us. He speaks about what Jesus can do for human beings in terms of transformation. I like that word. Transforming from all the things where we've made a mess of it into something much better. But it's all set in the goal of for the benefit of others. This is unselfish. And it reflects God's nature. God is love. God's agenda is the best for everyone. And we start to reflect that transformation. If you like, that's the divine answer as Paul sees it. And he expands it and explains it with logic and clarity and depth in the letter he wrote to the Romans. one of these words, one of these religious words. What we've got to recognize is that in the Hebrew language, that's the language of the Old Testament, there was one word group that was used. And in the Greek language, the language that Paul spoke, it had one word also. But in English, we have two word groups. And we have to remember that the Bible, the New Testament, was written in Greek and the Old Testament written in Hebrew. But we're getting translations. And one of the problems with translations is that we use two word groups, and for good reasons. But in the original Greek, it's one word group. Paul spoke his letter in Greek. But today we read it in translation in English, and the best way to read it is to read it in a modern translation, because the translators have used the two word groups to the best. If we're aware of this, it solves a lot of problems and confusions in Paul's writing. There wouldn't be confusions in the original language. Now hold on to your seats, just a little bit of grammar. I want us to look at the Greek and the English here and see if we can illustrate this. In the Greek language, the noun, we would translate it in English as either righteousness or justice. We have the two word roots based around righteousness and justice. But in the Greek, they've only got one word root. It's a common word in the New Testament. It's used 94 times. That's the noun. But we've also got the verb, used 40 times in the New Testament, and there's no easy verb in English from righteous or righteousness. So we tend in our English translations to use the verb to justify. Sometimes to make right or to make just, but these are slightly confusing. They don't quite capture the meaning of the original. To justify. Then we've got the adjective. Now this can be translated as right or righteous or just using the other word. Now if we're aware that there's only one word root in the Greek, D-I-K-A-I-O, and then the endings tell us whether it's a noun, verb or adjective. Whereas in English we've got two word groups, one based upon the word righteousness and one word based on the word justify. But both of these words in English translate the same word root with the same meaning in the Greek. This helps us to understand what Paul was driving at. So let's just put them up on screen. Righteousness can be looked at that way. Moral purity belonging to God alone. If it's related to human beings, it implies that we're leading a life that's pleasing to God, that in some way is consistent with, compatible with his moral purity. Now, the word justify, Paul uses the verb in the way it was used in the Greek language, often in connection with the law court. And in the law court, you come before the judge looks at the evidence and declares you not guilty. Now that's the word justify. In the Greek language, the verb. You're given the status of being accounted righteous. In other words, before the law, you have no charge to answer. Now, it doesn't mean you're perfect. It doesn't mean you're not going to make mistakes in the future. But in the eyes of the law, not guilty. You're cleared. You're accounted. It's a status. You're free to go. Now, that's the way the word was used. The verb was used at that time in the Greek language. There are phrases in the New Testament like perfect in righteousness. Now, nobody's perfect. The phrase means that this quality of lifestyle, righteousness, it's kind of running through your life. It's an underpinning principle in your life. There's the phrase, the righteousness of faith. Now here the word is being used in the sense we would use the word English to justify in the legal sense. That Jesus has given us the gift of the status of being acceptable to God. We've received the righteousness of Jesus, achieved by him for us, but he's given it to us as a gift. The righteousness of faith, or the righteousness that comes through faith, through our response, through our accepting what he has done. And then there's the righteousness of God, another phrase that's used. Two senses to it. It recognizes God's perfect moral purity. But it also recognizes that God offers us the status of righteousness. In other words, he will justify us. He will accept us. He will say, I accept you, you're not guilty. Doesn't mean to say you're morally perfect, or that you won't make mistakes, or you haven't made mistakes. But in his eyes, he says, I accept you. That's a status, like a legal status in a law court. These phrases are used in the New Testament. Now let's look at our two word roots again. This time I put up the nouns, righteousness and justification. Now the English, they don't quite carry the same meaning, but they come from the same word root in the Greek. Now, these are religious words. We've got to be clear, and there's no use using these words. We've got to put them into simple, straightforward language that means something to us today. So let's see if we can unpack these words a little bit further and get at something of their meaning. The word righteousness. Now, it's got two sides to its meaning. One word in the Greek leads to two word roots in the English. But there are two uses in the Greek language and the culture of the day. One of them describes status. You're back to the law court situation. The judge has declared you not guilty. You're free to go. It's a status. It does not mean you're perfect. And it does not mean you won't make mistakes. But your status in the eyes of the law is not guilty, you're free to go. Liberty. Now the other use of the word comes from lifestyle. The status means we're acceptable, but in lifestyle, it's referring to the lifestyle that comes out of the status. In other words, we're free for right living. It's interesting that in the Greek culture language, indeed in the theological understanding of the Bible, Old and New Testament, one word covers both sides, because in a sense they're inseparable. When we're acceptable to God, we are free to live quality lives, righteous living. One comes from the other. Status first, lifestyle second. But in Paul's letter, the emphasis he makes in this letter to the Romans is on the status side. In the latter part of the letter, he then takes it out into lifestyle. But the one word in the original language covers both aspects. Let's go back to Paul's theme again. I've expanded it slightly. If God is righteous, absolutely perfect in everything, and if contact with God requires that we be righteous, how can we become righteous? Most religions do it by self-effort. But if you think for a moment, self-effort is hopeless. You never know if you've made it. It's a counsel of despair. But indeed, it's useless in another way. Which human being is good enough by self-effort to make ourselves acceptable to God? You can't impress God, neither can I. It doesn't matter how hard we try, we're never going to make it. It's a hopeless task. And Paul recognizes that and works it out by cold logic. And indeed, it's what Jesus taught. But he speaks about receiving it as a gift. That's receiving acceptance before God, because he gives it to us. Now, how can God do that? What's the basis? How can we receive it? Paul works that through in the letter. That's fair, because it's available for every human being. If it's self-effort, we all start from different starting points, depending on our background, our home, our culture, our society. It's unfair, but this is fair. It's a question of receiving it. But what's the basis and how do we receive it? God accepts us as we are. That's the great theme that Paul works through in this letter. I've described that as utterly futile. That's the weakness of Islam, which is the religion today that emphasizes this self-effort most strongly. Here's the rule book, it says. Don't question it, do it. Who's good enough to impress God? But how is that possible? Often misrepresented and often misunderstood. As we unpack this letter that Paul wrote, we'll see the logic of how it happened and how it is possible, and then how it works out in life. Back to our words again. Moral purity belonging to God alone. Now that could be a description of status or of lifestyle. Paul starts with the status and he moves to the lifestyle. Justify, to declare righteous as a status. The judge says, not guilty, you're free to go. You're free to live your life to the full. And the process is known as justification. The process of declaring a person as having the status of righteousness before God. We're acceptable before God. He takes us as we are. Now there's the kind of meaning of these words, these religious words, and the way Paul was using them, reflecting the way of the language and the culture of his day. All of these ideas are very strongly Hebraic, coming from the Hebrew thought form of the Old Testament. All of this is based on the Old Testament. Paul did not invent this. Jesus did not contradict the Old Testament. He amplified and built it and expanded it, but even more important, he lived it. But in our modern Western thought today, these ideas are foreign. And yet they're soundly and logically presented to you by Paul, and the logic is still as good today. It all centers in God. God's character and nature, and the outworking of what he does. It's all one word, righteousness, because it's seen as one. It's complete, integrated. It can be seen as God acts, but God acts because he is. Actions come out of the nature within. That is true as well for us humans. It's all one integrated idea. Our status before God and our lifestyle. Our lifestyle comes out of our status. God's activity, God's actions reflect his nature, and they all stem from righteousness. God's overflowing, generous and creative nature of love. His agenda is the best for humanity. It's what he wants for you and me. He wants his created world to flourish. He doesn't want a set of rules. He doesn't want to bog us down. He doesn't want to make life impossible, restrictive. He wants us to flourish. He wants you to flourish in the world he has made. And we'll unpack this throughout this letter. God is the focus of righteousness. It's God's righteousness that is at the centre, because that's his nature, and his nature works out in what he does. And I want to touch upon 4 ways that we see this. And they all reflect God's righteousness, his nature, and the way he acts in this world. God is faithful. God is love. God can show anger. And there is judgment in God. None of these are contradictory or different sides of the coin. They're all integrated and they all reflect the fact that God is the best for all humanity in everything. Let's just look at it. God is utterly reliable. he keeps his promises. That's righteousness. He cannot act out with his nature. God's agenda is always the best for you and for me. We don't always understand it, but his agenda is always the best. Sometimes we walk away from it and then blame God when it doesn't work out, but his agenda is still always the best, because that's God's nature and it shows in his actions. But God is angry. I don't mean emotional anger, but he's angry against anything and anyone that tries to mess up all that he has made, including messing up you. And because he's angry, sometimes he steps in to put things right. It may mean that we are vindicated, or it may mean we have to face the consequences for things that we've done wrong in this life. But when we mess up really badly, when terrible things grow in the world, God sometimes just simply has to step in to put things right, because he loves, because he cares, because he's angry against anything or anyone that tries to mess up his creation. He's utterly reliable and consistent. God's actions come from God's nature. That's what we often think. This is what Paul is saying. That takes an awful lot of pressure off you, but it doesn't move your responsibility to respond to what he's done for us. And Paul works that through. God did it for us on the cross. You see, we rebel against God and trying to do it our way. I can do it myself. We just open ourselves up to the evil one. Biblical language says we put ourselves under a curse. Things go wrong. Satan has a go at us and makes our lives miserable. That's what Jesus did. By dying on the cross, he broke the curse over us because he did that. He took on the religious system of his day, coupled to the political system of the day. He allowed them to do the worst they could to him, torture him to death publicly. And in the process, he exhausted the power of evil and broke the curse over our lives. And he set us free from the control of the evil one, so that we could respond to God and be acceptable to him. This is very superficial, but it gives us a broad picture. Paul works it through, and he shows the futility of trying to do it ourselves. And he shows you what God has done for us, why he did it for us, and how we need to respond to it and make it real for ourselves. That's the introduction to the letter to the Romans. And in the next presentation, I'm going to set the scene as Paul sets it for us in the first chapter.